Good morning, folks. It's Friday, the 20th of February 2026, a Sanderson Trail report from about 10,400 feet on the peak trail. I had to get down away from the peak because there's a wild west-northwest wind throwing spindrift everywhere, gusting close to 40 miles an hour, sustained over 20 miles an hour, and I knew trying to record a video there would be hopeless. But this is kind of a more interesting view of what the terrain is. You can see my fresh snowshoe tracks behind me. If you look a little bit further up the line, you can probably see they're starting to disappear pretty quickly with all the spindrift in the air. Quick pan around, absolutely stellar sky, Salton Sea right there shining with the sun in the background, and some beautiful alto cumulus overhead. Jean Peak there, what for me is more or less ahead of me. So overnight we had, largely yesterday afternoon actually, on the 19th, we had about another 5 inches at the peak. That was the third of, I'm going to try and do the one-handed traverse as I go across here. That was the third of 3 storms in 4 days. And the 3 storms at the peak on the 16th was about 14 inches, on the 17th about another 7, and another 5 yesterday, for a total of about 26, which we are obviously very grateful for, because it's been a pretty desperate winter, but frankly underperformed the forecast. Most of the forecasting looks like we were on target for about 30 to 50 inches. I was certainly hoping for closer to 3 feet than 2 feet. You can see on these slopes how relatively shallow it is despite all the drifting. See all the bush tops still poking out. And when I can see those bush tops, then I know that it's at least it's certainly shallower than 3 feet, even where it's heavily drifted on these slopes. And I'll leave skiers to draw their own conclusions. Might be pretty good for this weekend, but as you can probably see there, plenty of rock and tips of rocks and bushes, even on this exposed east slope. So it dusted down. I can see, what's that, Ribbonwood. That's close to 4,000 feet. And this looks like a pretty decent dusting in Garner Valley. Maybe, might even be an inch, might even be a little bit more. Idlewild got 3 inches at 5,500 feet. So not big differences all the way up and down the mountain. Due to extreme drifting, some really strong winds over the last 2 or 3 days, it can be obviously much deeper in the trails than 26 odd inches would suggest. Also Strawberry Valley, because it faces southwest, which is where Idlewild is, got pretty socked in. So even times when the high country was above the cloud, it was receiving snow. So the very top, for example, Saddle, when I came through there earlier, it was about 22 inches, something like that. So not much less than the real high country. Annie's Junction at the PCT, about mile 1, what's that, about mile 181, just to about 9,000 feet. It does have a tendency to drift and accumulate there, but I mean it was probably as much as the peak, certainly over 2 feet. So beautiful snow conditions. Not sure if I can manage that right now, but really nice, light, fine powder. Lovely snowshoeing yesterday. It was really firm. Today it's pretty firm underneath, but obviously with a nice, not particularly loose, nice grippy few inches on top of that. He says taking a quick stumble. There we go. So snowshoe conditions great above certainly 8,000, even 7,000. The weather news is regrettable. It's going to get really warm really quickly. although the air temperature at San Jacinto Peak just now was, I had about 18 Fahrenheit. That's what, about -7, -8 centigrade. The wind chill was -7 Fahrenheit. That's about -23, 22, -22 centigrade. But the air temperature was fluctuating wildly. You could tell there were pockets of cold and warm air coming through. Got as high as 20 Fahrenheit at one point, which may not sound terribly high, but for the conditions, that's pretty remarkable. Both Anne and my friend Dan in Idlewild reported 19 Fahrenheit in Idlewild. So Idlewild's only a couple of degrees warmer, maybe only a degree warmer than San Jacinto Peak right now, obviously because they've got an inversion, but it's also an indication of how warm it is, relatively speaking, in the high country. So warm weather, it warms up really quickly. By Sunday, so 2 days' time, it's supposed to be above freezing up here and far above seasonal next week at mid-elevations, potentially as high as 70 Fahrenheit in Idlewild, which is obviously pretty remarkable for middle of February. And that looks sustained. The high pressure system to some extent moves back over Southern California, and the remainder of February very warm, and including the first week of March. So melting will be fast, because despite appearances, it is not actually particularly deep. And crampons and ice axe would be an option, because the powder's fairly firm underneath, but obviously with that weather forecast, that's not going to last very long. Maybe literally just this weekend. Once there's a consolidated track, which will probably be after this weekend, on some of the major trails, then it would probably spikes would be sufficient. But obviously I'll update that in due course. There'll be more photos and more specific information on the website, San Jacinto Trail Report. That's sanjackjohn.com, and a beautiful day up here, and safe hiking, everyone.